Is sounding okay? So I'm Joe, and where I'm coming at is like, initially I was an artist, and then became a speech therapist, and then now I'm in grad school to be a school psych. Oh,
Yeah, that's better.
apologize. Yeah, so I started off as an artist, but this was like pre-Instagram. I didn't know whether or not you could make it as an artist. And I grew up here in Brea, which is a city away. And I became a speech therapist and then a school psych, and have really studied and followed a lot of the symbolic world type stuff, and then got introduced to your stuff. And I have an instinct about a thing, but I can't expand it. And I think that you might have some tools to be able to expand it, or help me expand it. But the instinct is about the fire situation. So you have the bottom and you have the top, and whatever's at the bottom always gets like consumed. So that's a real problem. It's scary, and it's a thing that can happen. And so the instinct is to follow beauty is the first thing, but I want to know how disgust and beauty might be related to reverence instead of awe, the experience of awe.
So, I'll make sure I'm understanding your question. Your question is about the relationship between beauty and disgust with respect to the virtue of reverence and not just the awe experience. Did I understand you correctly?
Yeah, that's exactly it, yeah.
So I think part of what reverence does with the awe experience is it's a virtue that draws you into the proper relationship between appearance and reality. So I make use of Ricoeur's notion of the hermeneutics of suspicion, which has become predominant and is becoming monstrously predominant in our culture, that appearances deceive, they displace, they distort, right? And whereas the hermeneutics of beauty is that appearances actually disclose reality to us. And then I take Plato's argument and Merleau-Ponty's argument are that the first is always parasitic on the second. You can't find something to be an illusion unless you can point to something you find to be a reality. It makes no sense. When people say everything is an illusion, that doesn't literally mean anything. They mean most of everything is an illusion, but this experience or this experience is real, or something like that. So I think what reverence does, which awe doesn't do, is, and then this is at the edge of my work right now, so I want to be really cautious about this. But I think what reverence does is it properly tutors you in how to find the relationship between appearance and reality. Now the thing is, you have to understand that the hermeneutics of beauty is not just, right, the disclosure of what is pleasing. And I think Hahn, in his book on Saving Beauty, is really, really good about this. He says we've reduced the beautiful to the smooth. So the smooth is the easy, comfortable, pleasurable. And I think there can be, and then if you think of beauty only in that way, you lose what the ancients talked about, because they talk about being struck by beauty. Now, the interesting thing about disgust is also a situation in which we are becoming aware of an appearance that's disclosing a reality that is particularly threatening to us. So the original disgust, like the biophysical disgust, is we're becoming aware of something that will make us sick, like physiologically sick. And then that gets taken up, right? That gets taken up into other things. And this is where you have to be really careful around this, where there can be a beauty in the disclosure of what is threatening to us. So a place and this will be weird, but a place where I see that aesthetic coming is something like 2001 by Kubrick. So you've got this, there's obviously this, there's kind of beauty, but there's also this tremendous sense of threat. And I think the aesthetics of that movie, this is why he's a master, are sort of almost incomparable, that he weaves the two together, and that's what makes it so profound. I would put all of that under what I call the hermeneutics of beauty. Not just, ooh, I really like that, but oh, I really dislike that. If that's, I really dislike that and it's not illusory, the appearances are disclosing something to you, how it's threatening to you, not just affording to you. And I put that all under the hermeneutics of beauty. And I think reverence puts us in relationship to that. And then this is where I would introduce, Otto's notion of the numinous. The numinous is simultaneously threatening and it's also attractive to us, and there's an aesthetic around that. And I think, I don't know if anybody's done work on this other than Otto, so I could just be speaking from ignorance. But it'd be very interesting. There's a lot of good work being done on, right now in theology and philosophy about God is, the name of my God is beauty, and other books like that, where they're really getting back to the hermeneutics of beauty, and Schindler's doing this, and Faux is doing this, and others. But it would be really interesting if somebody went into the Bible and did the attempt to wrestle with the aesthetics of the numinous, because you've got these two things always close by, right? Like even the disgust, and the terror, and the embrace, and the love, and there's something going on there. Jonathan is probably better at that than I am.
Part of the reason was like I'm Catholic, very Catholic, and so, I didn't ask Jonathan, partly because I've read his brother's book. I was like, I knew part of the answer. I just was like, the answer is almost like fermentation, right? And I don't know how those connect, I know that it's required. And I also, part of the instinct also is with a lot of kind of what's going on with COVID in the church, specifically to do with like, okay, for Catholics, a lot of us, what'll happen is sometimes we have diocesan priests, they come in, and sometimes they're great and sometimes they're a little hippie-ish, and one of the things that gets lost is like, okay, you hold on to the Eucharist for us. And then now since COVID, like in the West, not only do we not have like a leavened bread, like we're starting to get rid of the wine. Nobody goes to drink the wine because because you could get sick, like literally. So the worry is that like, okay, we're burning through everything. And so that's where the instinct comes from. And I'm like, how do you take that disgust plus fermentation or whatever, make it practical, and then be able to like just go up a level, like not all the levels, you know what I mean? Like one at a time.
Yeah, I mean, there's difficulty because people readily confuse disgust and purity judgments with moral judgments.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, yeah, hardcore.
So the first thing is reverence can properly educate disgust so that it gets exapted into appropriate moral judgment or aesthetic judgment, not just a response. So I have no moral argument against my parents having sex. How could I? Here I am. I don't want to see them having sex. Okay, so that's not the same thing, right? And so, there's too much purity code, secular and religious, going on at the expense of the careful reverential uptake of it into, right? Not just the moral, but the relationship to the numinous.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Cameron?
I stay here. I'm here till 2:30, right?
All right, it's on. All right.
So my question has to do with emanation.
With imitation?
Emanation.
Emanation, sorry.
Idea of the top down.
The top down, yeah.
Trying to understand it from the Christian perspective and reconciling that with a cog-sci view, which I say I'm more familiar with, but deeply wanting to reconcile the two. And the problem I'm bumping against is I see emanation as close to confabulation in the sense that it comes up from, it's a representation we use. It's this imaginary that meets reality, but ultimately that's formed from a sort of dynamical systems bottom-up thing that gives rise to eventually a system that can have a top-down representation that then helps you predict your reality going forward. So I feel like that is in opposition with the Christian worldview, which is some sense a two worlds mythology that sees emanation as something other, a true top-down rather than a bottom-up.
Okay, well, I've given a couple of talks recently on this, and I've argued against the nominalist interpretation of the emanation, which is it's a cognitive representation, etc. And the reason for that, because if you have emergence up, and this upper level is not causally efficacious on its own right, you just have epiphenomenalism. You just have something that has no causal power. And I happen to think, by the way, epiphenomena do not exist. They cannot exist because if they have no causal powers, they cannot be known. If they have no causal powers, they cannot be measured. If they have no they are completely non-existent. And so if your version of emergence doesn't have the upper levels having real causal power downward, you have epiphenomena, and epiphenomena don't exist. So it's a modus tollens. That means that version of emergence must be wrong because it leads to a false conclusion. And there's a host of other arguments that go into the talk where it's no. The emerging level has to have an ontological reality. That's what I was saying about the scientist, and the scientist have to be real. And scientist qua scientist has to be doing things that are real in order to describe the bottom-up process. So if there isn't a top-down. Now the reason I think Guerrero is really helpful, and I think dynamics in action is the best way of applying dynamical systems to this. You have to understand that, right, we're talking two different metaphysical categories. Emergence is actualization, and emanation is conditionalization. What do I mean by that? Like, why does this move? Right? Well, the bottom-up explanation is bumpation, which is what we reduced all of causation to. My hand bumped into this, and it moved. Right? That's causation. But you also have to talk about all the conditions. This has a shape it has. This is flat. Right? And conditions are not events. The relationship between events is causal. The relationship between conditions are constraints, right? So the tree, the causal, well, this is plastic, but the causal processes cause the structure, but the structure changes the conditions. So the causal processes produce leaves like this to increase the probability that a photon will interact with a chlorophyll molecule. That's not do you understand it? That's not the same thing as a causal event. It's causes shape actuality, constraints shape possibilities. And science is dependent on possibilities being real. Predictions require there to be real counterfactuals. Information requires there to be real alternatives. I can't destroy energy by stopping kinetic energy because there's potential energy. That's a top-down thing. Whenever you're invoking potential, whenever you're invoking law, whenever you're invoking constraint, whenever you're invoking counterfactual, you're invoking real top-down. Now, I think that is consonant with the Neoplatonic strand. Like I say, there's so many strands of Christianity. And I don't mean that insulting. I'm sometimes overwhelmed by I feel like no matter what I say, there'll be some Christian saying, that's not Christianity, right? So, and that's fair, that's fine. I'm sure that'd be the same for Buddhists too. The point I'm making is the Neoplatonic strand, which to be fair to me has been a predominant strand of Christianity, would, I think, completely agree, because that's how many of the current Christian Neoplatonists are taking up the idea of emanation. Where I differ from some of them is I'm a late Neoplatonist rather than an early. I think the argument that emergence and emanation are completely interdependent, and the polarity is more important than the poles. That's how I would answer that.
Okay, that helps a lot. That helps me understand affordances too, because affordances are only there with constraints, and that's the top-down aspect,
Yes.
it seems. Okay, and that's the optimal gripping that then is allowed from that.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you.
Trey?
I don't think your mic's on.
Trey? Here. A book on the previous topic on beauty would be The Ethics of Beauty by Batistas.
Yes. Also, Scari's book on beauty and how it prepares us for truth and justice. Excellent book.
Well, if Trey's not here, how about Ken?
All right, hello.
Hey, Ken.
Hello. In my videos, I try to presence the audience to a conversation, so welcome. So before I ask the question, I would like to make it. One of the things I heard you say in your talk yesterday was that this notion of home is very closely connected with the place in which relevance realization realizes its own irrelevance. Can you talk about that, and am I hearing you?
Yeah, I didn't want to place that within the idea of home. I tried to place home within this sort of evolutionary and why we long for it. What I was saying is, I was picking up on Jonathan's proposal that there's a kind of an ultimate home. So one of the things that we've done with various philosophical and religious traditions is we have exapted the notion of home. So a good way of understanding Stoicism is, how can I be at home in the cosmos? So instead of trying to attach home and the homing to any place, I attach home to wherever I can practice virtue, right? And then I heard Jonathan extending it, and I was making a very similar, I came to a very similar point, that I want to take the belonging and the orientation and the leveling up that home has educated and educed in us, and then lift it up, exapt it into how can we get reoriented, re-belonging, right? All of that machinery, how can we apply it to capturing, that's the wrong word, scratch capturing, cultivating the reorientation that is needed right now. And I heard Jonathan saying that, and I was trying to articulate what do we have to get to that most original point of reorientation. So don't go to the sort of physical instantiation of these functions. Let's go to the core function. And how do we get to the core function there, that base point, so that we can reorient again? That's what I would say. Sorry, Ken, I took up some of your time, and that's unfair to you.
No worries, that's fine. Okay, so in some sense, part of our goal in this entire movement would be to find that place as best we can to reinventio where we have gone wrong. Am I hearing?
Yes, and I'm trying to both familiarize, and look at the word familiar, and having to do with family, home. I'm trying to refamiliarize you with the cognitive processes, but I'm also trying to radicalize it in the sense of taking it back down to the origin, so the greatest field of possibilities, but not unconstrained, chaotic, but the greatest field of possibilities is available to us.
Okay, perfect. That's a long preamble for the actual question. Assuming that is something of a telos that might be worthwhile to pay attention to. We were having a conversation, Catherine, Paul, and myself and my brothers, on our drive over here this morning, related to the issue of the two worlds mythology.
Yes.
And so my question has to do with, to what degree is the two worlds mythology helpful to get us there?
That's a really good question. Because my relationship with the two worlds mythology is profoundly ambivalent. Profoundly ambivalent. I'm very grateful for the axial revolution and the way it was homed, and I think we can now use that, the way it was homed within the two worlds mythology, and it gave us a totally different notion of meaning and wisdom and transcendence, and I don't want to let any of that go. I think, though, what has happened, and I think maybe irrevocably, is the two worlds mythology got codified in really disastrous ways into our way of thinking. So Descartes' mind-body dualism, which is a disaster. By the way, you have to understand. I wish I made mistakes like Descartes, right? Like it's like the reasons he had to do this are profound, and I go into them. But that's the embodiment, that's the internalization of the two worlds mythology within us, and it radically disconnects us from ourselves, from each other, from the world. And to the degree to which it's doing that, I think the two worlds mythology is tremendously harmful and exacerbating of the meaning crisis. And I think if we hang on to it, it also makes it very difficult to run, because we run up against arguments running through the Neoplatonic tradition, and then they even get picked up in the Cartesian beautifully, amazingly, deeply by Spinoza. And then we have these horrible sort of reduced, degenerate versions now. But the idea that it doesn't make sense to talk about two worlds because and this is Spinoza's argument, what is it that relates them together? And if the relationship between them is intelligible and causal, you have one world. And if it's not intelligible and causal, you have absurdity and disaster. And so I think that argument is a very good argument. I think it needs to be responded to. Now, I'm very sensitive, of course, to some of the points that Paul makes around, there might be sort of an imaginal function here that is necessary for the spirit of finesse. And I take that very seriously, and I understand what he means. We seem to want to talk about top and bottom and in and out a lot. I guess my project is, can we reinventio that enacted imaginal that seems indispensable to our human way of being without it being reified into a two worlds ontology?
Thank you.
That was great, Ken.
Is Trey here? Well, if Trey doesn't show up, then there's an open seat for someone else.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jack Pitts, and my question to you, John, is when it comes to connecting to Christians on the general issue of openness practices, I think there is more required in your distinction between daemon and demon. Mm-hmm. And I understand that they're different concepts. I'm not entirely sure that they're different beings. So my question would be, how can Christian artists who believe in the reality of created spiritual forces, who are very interested in these other ways of seeing and understanding, and for myself, these other ways of seeing and understanding which you have discussed at length with Jonathan, that itself is what has brought me to actually take the idea of created spiritual forces seriously in their own right. But at this point, I do believe that they have a fuller ontology, as you've said. And so how can we, who take those beings as real, cultivate and tend our openness that's required in our craft?
Jack, this is an excellent question. And it's a really excellent question. You know, the work I do with Jonathan and the work I do with Dan Chappie and other people, bringing back the daemonic, this idea of spirits that can inhabit collectives. I think that it then demands that the question you're raising be addressed. And this goes back to one of the ancient dimensions of wisdom that we need to bring back without just nostalgically repeating the way we talked about it before. Because if we just talked about it the way we were before, most people are not going to listen or pay attention. With good reason, I think. And that's this idea of discerning the spirits. And so a crucial thing is discerning the spirits. And it's interesting that, I mean, across traditions, and it's in the Bible too. It's by their fruits you shall know them, right? And so the way there's nothing sort of phenomenologically you can do, but you can't do that for yourself. Like, what's it feel to be wise? Like, it doesn't work, right? Like, you have to, and that's why I tell people, when they're asking me as a teacher, how do I know I'm on the path? Well, like, what will I feel? And I say, don't pay attention so much to what you feel. Pay attention to how people are seeing you. What are they giving back to you? What are they noticing in you? Right? Because that's usually a much better measure. And in the same way, right, when you're interacting with these beings, I mean, a daemon should show up as a muse, like the artist's muse, and it should be musical in the extended sense. And it should lead to reciprocal opening. It should help afford virtue. It should connect you to other people who are reliably growing towards the true, the good, and the beautiful. And the demonic will reciprocally narrow you. It will shut you down, and it will make you confused about how good your work is. You'll become narcissistic. You'll become grandiose. You'll become too self-deprecating. And so, for me, I don't see any reason to not interact with those beings in an evaluative sense the way I would interact with you. If every time I interact with you, you're manipulating me and drawing me and trying to spiral me down so I get addicted to you, I'm going to stay away from you. If I enter into good faith relationship and we get mutually accelerating disclosure and we get reciprocal opening and we both keep getting to places we couldn't get to on our own, then I'll commit to you. I'll entrust myself to you. And I think it's the same principle.
Yes, but there are things that I am able to trust about you because we share a particular form of existence, but because we're persons of the same type.
But just to interrupt, you also, in fact, this was Erickson's point, you more fundamentally have that relationship with the world, and you trust the world, and the world isn't a person, and yet you have learned, you don't just blindly, oh, the world will take care of me, right? You don't do that. But you've got this place, there's a relationship between trust and optimal grip where you're relating to it, and you can you can fall in love with the world in a proper way, in an Ericksonian way. So you don't have to have equal ontological status for this to be possible to you, right?
No, but I don't necessarily have, this is the tension for me, and this is the question, is I think that the inspiration exists. I think that the idea behind the muse or the muses exist, and I think they participate. I also think that a lot of Christians, I don't know exactly how I fit on this, but a lot of Christians will look at the muses as suspect, as pagan, and perhaps reciprocally narrowing, perhaps even malevolent.
But if they do that without evidence, that's just prejudicial.
But I don't know that there is no evidence. I mean, if you look at,
But that's my
if you look
point.
at the idea of a genius, right, as an artistic genius, but if you also look at the lives of the Romantics, some of the most beautiful poetry and music, and some very, very dark, narrowed lives which are lived.
But that's exactly what I mean about by the fruits. I didn't say just the aesthetic product, like, right? And I said they can manipulate you so you feel like you're reciprocally opening, but this is no different than video game addiction. You get into the flow state in the video game, and you are naturally affined and seeking the flow state, and and yet the problem is it reduces your capacity. It doesn't transfer, and it reduces your capacity to flow in the world. And then what happens is the world looks depressive, and so you spend more time in and the whole thing narrows, and you get locked down. But you have to. It's like if you take psychedelics or you do any practice, like you have to set it into a sapiential and sacred context. You have to do the same thing with discerning the spirits. So I hope that was helpful.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.